He handed his mother a brunch menu. She handed her son a property appraisal valuing her co-signer's share at $410,000. His jaw locked, her voice didn't shake. "I'm not leaving quietly, Jake. I'm leaving with the deed." By the time he realized his mother still owned the house, the sale had already gone through. Now he's packing boxes in a home built on her signature. He said I was just the co-signer, Ruth thought. I was the one who gave the signature that built the roof over his head. Ruth wasn't supposed to be there, at least not according to the invitation, or lack thereof. But when she noticed Jake putting on his dress shoes and whispering to Olivia near the door, she quietly grabbed her cardigan and purse, then slid into the car behind them without making it a conversation. Now, in the frosted glass corner of the bank office, she sat in a chair that had clearly not been pulled out for her. No one offered coffee. Olivia didn't look her way. Jake barely acknowledged her. But Ruth smiled politely, folded her hands, and let her eyes drift over the mortgage officer's polished desk as if she were just some elderly observer with nowhere else to be. Until Jake opened his mouth. "Oh, my mom? She's not involved in anything anymore. Just the co-signer, way back when." The laugh he let out was light, casual, like it was meant to put the banker at ease. Olivia followed it with a practiced smile. "We're streamlining everything. Just us this time, more efficient." The mortgage officer smiled politely, jotted a note. Ruth blinked slowly. The words didn't stab, they settled like sandbags, heavy, deliberate. She said nothing, not here. Not in a room where everyone had already decided she was furniture. The meeting continued. Numbers, terms, phrases like debt-to-income ratio and ownership consolidation. Ruth kept her mouth shut, but her heart, it pounded like it remembered a version of itself that used to speak up. She glanced at Jake. Confident, comfortable, too comfortable. Flashback, 5 years earlier. Jake, 29, sat at her kitchen table, eyes bloodshot, fingers trembling over a rejection letter. "They turned me down, Mom. I've got nothing. The loan officer said maybe if I had a co-signer with real equity. I hate asking." Ruth reached across the table and took his hands. He squeezed hers like a child again. "I just need your name, Mom, not your money. You'll always have a say, promise." She remembered the look in his eyes, desperate, boyish, sincere. She had believed him. She signed without hesitation. Now, 5 years later, in this sleek bank office, Jake didn't even glance at her before handing the mortgage officer a neatly bound refinance packet. Ruth stared at her son as he smiled. Her son, the same boy she'd clipped coupons for, driven to every SAT prep class, and paid for college books when his refund didn't arrive in time. "Just the co-signer," he'd said. The ride home was quiet. Olivia scrolled through her phone in the passenger seat. Jake hummed along with the radio. Ruth watched the houses blur by. Each one looked like hers, and none of them did. When they pulled into the driveway, Ruth walked to her back unit without a word. She didn't slam the door, didn't sigh or text anyone. She just removed her shoes, walked into her bedroom, and knelt at the edge of the bed. She reached under, pulled out the small fireproof safe, and entered the code she hadn't used in years. Click. Inside, papers, wills, tax returns, a picture of her husband in a military uniform, and beneath that, a manila folder marked in faded ink. Property title 2019. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the deed. She scanned it, line by line. And there it was. Primary owner, Ruth Carter. Secondary co-borrower, Jacob Carter. Her name first, his second. She had forgotten. He clearly hadn't. He just thought she had. Ruth leaned back, the folder pressed against her chest. In that moment, it wasn't anger that filled her, it was something colder. Awareness. She hadn't just co-signed a mortgage, she'd built the roof, and they'd tried to lock her out of it. Ruth placed the folder on her nightstand, turned off the light, and whispered into the dark. "I was never just anything." Tomorrow she would remember exactly what she owned. They threw a housewarming. I built the warmth and wasn't even invited. The laughter hit her ears before she saw the cars. It started like a low murmur from the front of the house. Voices, clinking glasses, bursts of exaggerated laughter drifting through the air like perfume Ruth hadn't been warned about. She pulled the curtain back and blinked at the growing line of vehicles snaking along the curb. SUVs, a convertible, a rental car she didn't recognize. She wasn't expecting guests, which meant they weren't hers. Still in her slippers, Ruth stepped out onto the porch of her back unit, heart steady but pulse quickening. She squinted down the gravel path toward the front driveway. White twinkle lights had been strung along the eaves. There was a welcome home banner taped to the porch. A playlist pulsed softly from someone's Bluetooth speaker, jazz, pop, covers of wedding songs. Jake was laughing near the front steps, holding a drink. Olivia stood beside him in a silky taupe dress, her hand resting lightly on his arm like punctuation. A woman in heels cradling a wine glass noticed Ruth and approached with the loose friendliness of someone already 2 pours in. "Oh, I didn't realize the tenant lived out back," she smiled. Olivia said this was family-owned now, so smart of them to get rid of the older tenants. Ruth blinked, then smiled tightly. "I suppose it depends which family member you ask." She turned before the woman could reply, walked back to her porch, closed the screen door with care. Inside, she sat on the edge of her armchair and stared at the wall, not at anything, just through it. Her name wasn't on the invitation list, but her signature was on the deed. Her sweat in those floorboards. Her casseroles had baked in that oven. Her husband's ashes were buried under the rosemary bush by the back window, and Olivia had just called it family-owned, meaning not Ruth. She moved to the window, keeping behind the blinds. From there, she could see everything. Olivia led a group through the house, pointing and smiling like a real estate agent giving a tour. Her voice carried just enough. "We just finished remodeling the bathroom. I told Jake, it's our space now, finally." More laughter, more clinks. Ruth pressed her fingertips against the glass. Flashback, 7 years earlier. The same kitchen, dimly lit, covered with casserole dishes and condolence flowers. Ruth, in black, pulled a casserole from the oven. Jake stood beside her, 28, holding a beer and wiping his nose. "You're not selling the house, right?" he'd asked. "It feels like home for both of us." She'd nodded. She didn't have the heart to move after her husband's funeral. Jake had needed stability. She had needed to mother something. She stayed. Back in the present, Ruth sat down at her small writing desk and opened a blank text message to Jake. She typed, "You forgot whose name signed the oven in." She stared at the screen for a long moment, then hit delete. Just before midnight, the music finally stopped. Guests shuffled out, doors slammed, but the twinkle light stayed on. Jake and Olivia laughed about how chill the neighbors were, except the one in the back, as if Ruth no longer existed. The next morning, Ruth brewed coffee and opened her laptop. She hadn't checked her credit in years. She logged in. Primary mortgage account active. Borrower #1, Ruth Carter. Borrower #2, Jacob Carter. Liability, joint. Late fee. Risk, moderate. Ruth stared at the screen, not shocked, just confirmed. They were partying on her credit. She carried the debt, they carried the wine. She took a screenshot and saved it in a folder. Asset recovery, start here. Because now it wasn't about memory, it was about math. He said it was for safety. I heard him say, "You don't belong here anymore." The keypad blinked red. Ruth stared at it, her laundry basket pressed against her hip, fingertips hovering over the numbers as if she might have misremembered. She typed the code again, her code, the same one Jake had given her when they first remodeled the entry to include digital locks. 196 enter. Beep, denied. Another red flash. The hallway light inside flickered on. Footsteps approached, slow and hesitant. Then came the familiar click of the manual lock turning, and the door creaked open just an inch. Olivia. She was barefoot, wrapped in a pale blue robe, her hair tied up, phone still in hand. "Oh," she said, then blinked, caught between fake surprise and forced grace. "Hey, Ruth." Ruth didn't smile, she simply gestured to the keypad. "Just here to do laundry." Olivia stepped onto the porch, half blocking the door. "Right, Jake changed the code. His dad's friend got robbed, remember? We just feel safer limiting access." We, not Jake. Not an explanation, just exclusion dressed as precaution. Ruth didn't argue. She didn't ask for the new code. She nodded once. "Of course, safety first." Back in her unit, the laundry basket sat untouched. Ruth filled the sink, added detergent, and hand-washed her blouse in silence. Her reflection in the window stared back. Not hurt, not surprised, just quietly aware. Her name was still on the house, but not on the locks. Flashback, 1992. A tiny apartment above a deli. Jake is 6, giggling as he stands on a step stool next to the dryer, shirt 3 sizes too big in his hands. Ruth folds towels beside him, guiding his small fingers with hers. One fold here, then another like this, see? Jake beams with pride. "I'm going to help every time." Back then, he had begged to be involved, eager to participate in the smallest responsibilities. Now he was a man who changed locks in silence. That night, Ruth hung the damp blouse on a wooden hanger and placed it near the heater vent. She sat in her armchair with a blanket and her planner but didn't write anything, just stared at the open pages, the silence of her unit growing thicker with each passing second. Outside, laughter rose again from the front of the house. Olivia and Jake watching a show, something with a laugh track. The sound was grainy through the drywall, familiar but detached. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up from the coffee table. Instagram. Olivia posted a new story. She clicked it without thinking. A selfie in front of the kitchen island, Olivia grinning in a silk headband, glass of wine raised in hand. Text overlay, can't wait to finally own our space this year. Everything's falling into place. Ruth stared at the screen. She didn't react, didn't send it to anyone, didn't screenshot it. She just let the screen go dark. She stood, walked back to the sink, and turned off the heater vent. No more hand-washing what they pretended she couldn't afford, because now she knew what they were planning. And she wasn't going to knock next time. He thought I couldn't read the fine print. I used to write it. Ruth held the phone like it might explode. The dial tone buzzed once, then twice, then a familiar voice answered, bright and clipped. "This is Sarah at Golden Leaf Lending. How can I help you?" Ruth hesitated. Her voice came out more controlled than she expected. "Sarah, it's Ruth Carter. I was the original borrower on a mortgage your office signed 5 years ago. My son, Jacob Carter, was the co-borrower." A pause. Paper rustling, keystrokes in the background. "Yes, I remember. We've had some recent activity on that file, actually." Ruth's grip tightened around the base of the receiver. "I'm not calling about the refinance. I'm calling to ask something simple. Can you confirm who holds majority ownership on the property?" Sarah sounded surprised by the question, but not concerned, just matter of fact. One moment, pulling up the original documents now. A beat. "Okay, here we are. You are listed as the primary borrower. Mr. Carter was added as secondary after underwriting approval. Your trust owns a 60% controlling share. That was filed under the property protection clause at signing, if you recall." Ruth didn't recall, but her husband had. She hung up the phone slowly, her knuckles pale. The room felt louder now, as if every shadow had something to say. She walked to the desk in the corner, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a faded blue folder marked in her husband's handwriting. Estate Trust, do not discard. Inside, page after page of documents, most of which she'd never touched since he passed. At the top of one, Life Protective Revocable Trust Agreement, Carter Household Property. There it was. She'd forgotten that he'd filed it, insisted on it. "Keep this paperwork like it's your spine," he told her 12 days before the heart attack. "This house is part of your dignity. Don't ever let anyone confuse you about what you built." Back then, she'd nodded, smiled, folded the papers away like a widow's future could be filed alphabetically. Now, years later, they were the only thing standing between her and erasure. Ruth sat on the bed, trust papers in her lap, sunlight casting gold lines across the floor. She didn't cry for Jake anymore, only for what she had allowed. Olivia calling it her space, Jake laughing her into the background, parties thrown in rooms she once called hers. She opened her laptop and typed, "Real estate lawyer, co-ownership dissolution, California." Third tab in, "We don't get even, we get equitable." She clicked schedule consultation. That evening, an email arrived. Subject confirming legal standing, co-owner rights. "You hold authority to initiate a partition action and dissolve the co-ownership. Ready when you are. Maggie Tarlow." JD Ruth reread it twice. She replied, "Let's begin." Not just reclaiming the house, she was correcting the cost of her silence. He didn't just want me off the mortgage, he planned to refinance me out of his life. The PDF loaded slowly. Ruth sat still, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, the cursor spinning as if it knew the weight of what was coming. Her laptop screen glowed pale in the evening light, the only sound in the room the slow whirl of her tabletop fan and the soft clink of ice settling in her water glass. Download complete. The subject line had been clinical. Review, forwarded refinance correspondence requested by counsel. She clicked. The first few pages were familiar. Copies of loan estimates, property comps, digital signature fields, nothing she hadn't seen before. Her breath stayed even, her heart not quite. Then came page 7. A screenshot embedded in the middle of an email chain. It was a text message thread from Jake, sent to the mortgage officer, included for documentation. Attached beneath it, something she almost missed. A cropped note from Olivia. The text was small, but unmistakable. Once the refinance clears, we'll update the title. She's old. She won't fight us. Ruth's hand froze on the trackpad. Her eyes didn't move for a long moment. Then slowly, quietly, she closed the laptop. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't crumble. Instead, she reached for her phone, opened the Notes app, and typed just one sentence. This wasn't forgetfulness, it was strategy. That night, she went to the hallway closet and pulled out the metal box she hadn't opened in 12 years. Inside, old tax returns, 2 hard drives, a black flash drive labeled in her husband's handwriting, LLC Backup 2010. She sat cross-legged on the floor and plugged it into her laptop. 10 minutes later, the screen lit up with a familiar name. Carter Household Services, LLC, inactive. Status, filed 2008, dissolved 2015. Reason, no longer needed. Except now it was. The next morning, Ruth took the paperwork to her lawyer. Can we reactivate the LLC? She asked. Maggie blinked. You want to transfer your trust's property share into a corporate entity? Ruth nodded. I want this house under a name that can't be guilt-tripped. Maggie smiled just slightly. You're playing chess now, Ruth. Ruth looked her dead in the eye. No, I'm flipping the board. She went home that evening and pulled out a photo album she hadn't touched in a while. Second shelf, leather-bound, dusty, but intact. She flipped through the pages until she found the one she was looking for. Jake, 14 years old, standing on a middle school auditorium stage, braces, buzz cut, 2 big khakis, holding a third-place math trophy, grinning like he'd just conquered the world. She remembered that night. She remembered making him flashcards when he wanted to quit, the nights they stayed up after midnight practicing algebra over grilled cheese and orange soda. Back then, he'd thanked her by name when they handed him the trophy. My mom helped me get here, he'd said. She's the one who made me fight for it. She traced his young face on the photo, then closed the album. You taught me to let you fall, Jake, she whispered. I just never thought I'd watch you trip over me. 3 days later, the partition order was ready. Her lawyer sent it for her review. It was official, sterile, cold in its clarity. Legal notification of co-ownership dissolution, partition action filed. Filed on behalf of Ruth E. Carter, trustee of the Carter Family Trust and sole officer of Carter Household Services, LLC. The stamp at the bottom was fresh. The envelope, thick and certified, would arrive in Jake's mailbox tomorrow. Ruth sealed her copy in a folder, slipped it into her fireproof safe, and looked out the window toward the main house. Jake didn't know it yet, but he had just received his first eviction notice from the woman who made sure he had somewhere to live in the first place. He offered me brunch. I brought him the market value of his mistake. The invitation came in a text, short, polite, and clearly written through gritted teeth. Hey, Mom, can we grab breakfast tomorrow? Just talk. My treat. Ruth stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, Sure, 9 a.m. at Haven Diner. She didn't ask why. She already knew. The next morning, she arrived 5 minutes early and chose a table by the window. Sunlight spilled across the white formica. A waitress set down a carafe of coffee and asked if she was waiting for someone. Yes, Ruth said calmly, but I'm not in a hurry. Jake walked in 3 minutes late, khakis wrinkled, eyes tired. He gave a sheepish smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thanks for coming. Ruth folded her hands on the table. You asked, I came. Let's not pretend it's anything deeper than that. He winced, but didn't push back, just sat and signaled the waitress. They ordered scrambled eggs, toast, bacon, normal. But Ruth's appetite didn't follow the plates. Jake leaned in, elbows on the table, hands fidgeting with a paper sugar packet. Look, I heard about the partition filing, the certified letter, the LLC stuff. You really went all in? Ruth sipped her coffee, didn't answer. He pushed on. I get that you're upset, I do. Maybe we didn't handle things perfectly, but do you really want this to go full legal war? Ruth didn't flinch. If that's what it takes to be treated like a co-owner, then yes. He inhaled sharply. What if we bought you out? Just a clean break. We get the house, you walk away with something. Everyone wins. Ruth set her cup down. From her bag, she pulled out a crisp folder and slid it across the table. Jake opened it. Inside, a printed property appraisal, signed and dated 3 days ago. Highlighted in yellow, Fair market value, Ruth Carter's ownership share, $410,000. His jaw tensed. Come on, that's ridiculous. Ruth raised an eyebrow. It's math, not a negotiation. You wanted ownership? That's the cost of control. Jake sat back, blinking. His voice dropped. We don't have that kind of money. Ruth didn't blink. Then it's a short sale. The house goes, we both leave. Take your pick. Flashback, age 15. Jake pacing the living room, dressed in a tuxedo jacket that still had the price tag tucked inside. I swear I can cover prom. I just need to borrow your credit card for now. I'll pay you back next week. He didn't. She found the charges 3 weeks later, limousine, corsage, $60 sushi bill. When confronted, he cried, apologized, then repeated the pattern 2 months later for summer camp gear. Back in the diner, Ruth watched him squirm in his seat, watched the realization bloom across his face. Not that she was bluffing, but that she wasn't. Jake looked away for a long time. We just wanted the space to feel like ours. Ruth's voice was calm as ever. Then you shouldn't have built that dream on my equity and expected me to stay small. She stood. Send your decision to my lawyer. She left cash for the coffee, tucked her folder back into her bag, and walked out, leaving her half-eaten breakfast and half-spoken history behind. That night, Ruth, in pajamas with tea and her legal folder, listened to Olivia's voicemail. If you go through with this, your name's ruined. People side with us, not someone who kicks out family. Hope you're ready. She saved it and forwarded it to her lawyer. Add to the file. They're writing their own reputation now. The next day, Ruth overheard 2 neighbors gossip. She's losing her memory. She still drives, though? The laugh that followed was careless. Ruth didn't react. She finished trimming the hedge, then went inside, opened her laptop, and created a folder. Truth. She uploaded original deed, trust clause, mortgage breakdown, LLC reactivation, CPA license, still valid. She emailed it to her neighbors. Hi. Nancy, just sharing this in case any confusion arises. Best, Ruth. Then she clicked send. Later that evening, her phone buzzed. Text from Nancy Peterson. I always wondered why you were in the garage unit. Thought maybe it was a choice. Guess it wasn't. A second message followed. George says you're tougher than any HOA board. Let us know if you need help. Ruth exhaled, just once. It wasn't joy, it was relief without surprise. She didn't need the whole neighborhood. She just needed someone to remember who she'd been before the whispers started. That night, the house was unusually quiet. Olivia must have been out. Jake's car was there, but the lights in the front windows stayed dim. Ruth stood in her own doorway for a while, staring at the dark path that led from her back unit to the main house. Then, almost involuntarily, she walked it. The spare key she'd kept for years still worked. She turned it slowly, then stepped into the kitchen. It was warm inside, stale air and faint traces of wood polish, distant but familiar, like walking into an old movie set where she used to be the lead but now just swept the floor. She ran her hand across the tile counter. The grout was still chipped in the corner where her husband had joked he'd eyeball the edge. She had tiled this counter herself after he died, a project to stay busy, to stay sane. She didn't stay long, just enough to remember the texture. Flashback, 1994. Ruth standing in the same kitchen, her husband behind her, handing her a steaming mug. Don't wait for the world to remember your worth, he'd said, voice gravelly but kind. Make them. Back in her unit, Ruth placed her hand on the desk drawer where the trust documents lived. She didn't open it. She just stood in front of it and said quietly, Message received. The next morning, a white envelope slid under Ruth's door. The return address wasn't Jake's, but the law firm's name was familiar. Inside, motion filed, petition to block property partition, grounds, alleged mental instability of co-owner Ruth E. Carter. Her stomach didn't drop in fear, just recognition. They weren't whispering anymore. They were trying to erase her. She dialed her attorney. Hi, Maggie. We've got a new development. Good news? Ruth's voice stayed even. It's a test. I plan to pass. They tried to call her unstable. She replied with her still valid CPA license. At 9 a.m. sharp, the doorbell rang. Ruth was already ready, neat blouse, hair set, calm eyes. On the porch stood a woman in a gray blazer, clipboard in hand. Miss Carter? Dana Willoughby. Court-appointed evaluator. Ruth nodded. Coffee's on. They sat in the living room, sunlight soft through lace curtains. Dana flipped open her folder. This is routine. I'll just ask a few questions. Ruth smiled politely, posture perfect. I've managed IRS audits with less grace. Go ahead. They began with basic memory tests. Name, date, address, birthday. Ruth answered each without pause. Then came attention checks, pattern questions, simple arithmetic. Ruth recited them effortlessly. Dana scribbled notes but didn't hide her slight amusement. You're fast. Most people your age pause at the subtraction sequences. Ruth raised an eyebrow. I taught tax law night courses in the 90s. Numbers are the one thing I trust not to lie. Dana nodded. Fair point. Then came the more nuanced questions. Do you manage your own finances? Ruth walked to her desk, pulled out a thin folder, and handed it to Dana. Inside, printed bank statements, a recent investment portfolio update, and last year's tax return with Ruth's signature at the bottom. Filed jointly when I was married, alone for the last 12 years, and always on time. Dana smiled as she flipped through the paperwork. Thorough. It's the only way to be taken seriously, Ruth replied. They shifted to abstract questions, hypotheticals about property management, estate distribution, emotional decision-making. Let's say someone attempts to alter a shared asset behind your back, Dana began. What's your response? Ruth looked her square in the eyes. Document everything, create a paper trail, never shout when you can submit evidence instead. Dana actually laughed at that. I might use that line. An hour passed, then 90 minutes. The conversation flowed. Ruth didn't rush, didn't overcompensate. She let the weight of her preparation carry the room. Eventually, Dana glanced toward the bookshelf behind Ruth and noticed a thin, gold-rimmed certificate, dusty but unbent. She leaned toward it. Is that what I think it is? Ruth followed her gaze. CPA license, Certified Public Accountant, State of California, issued 1989. Dana raised her brows. Still active? Ruth nodded. Renewed every cycle, even after I retired. I may not use it anymore, but I'm not done being accountable. There was a long pause. Dana leaned back, closed her folder, and looked at her with a faint grin. You're sharper than half my clients under 40, Ruth. That evening, the phone rang just before sunset. Ruth picked it up, the caller ID flashing Tarlow and Associates. Hi, Maggie, she said calmly. Well, her lawyer replied, I hope you made good coffee. Ruth chuckled softly. She had 2 cups. Then you'll like this. Petition denied. Judge tossed the challenge. You're fully cleared. We move forward. Ruth said nothing for a moment, just let the words land. Then, thank you, Maggie. Let's take the next step. She walked to the wall, gently wiped the dust from the edge of her license frame, and whispered, They tried to rewrite my mind. I'll rewrite their ending instead. He asked for one final meal. I gave him roast and reality. The table was set for 3, white plates, cloth napkins, and candles burning like it was Thanksgiving, but the air felt colder than the frost clinging to the edges of the window panes. Ruth sat at the far end of the table, her back straight, her breath calm despite the ache in her chest. Jake had called that morning. Let's just have dinner. One meal. Clear the air. She said yes, not because she hoped for peace, but because she wanted her voice to echo in the room that had forgotten it. Olivia opened the door when Ruth arrived, face expressionless. No smile, no welcome, just a silent pivot to let her pass. The house smelled of rosemary and garlic, Jake's favorite roast recipe. Ruth had taught it to him years ago. Olivia must have Googled the version she remembered him liking better. Ruth stepped into the dining room and noticed Olivia's touch on everything. The gold chargers, the stemless wine glasses, the filtered playlist humming from a Bluetooth speaker. It was curated warmth, but none of it was hers. Jake stood in the kitchen, carving the roast. Hey, Mom, he sounded tired. Maybe that was real. She gave him a soft nod. Thank you for the invitation. They ate mostly in silence. Midway, Jake said, This isn't how I pictured any of this. Ruth replied coolly, I'm not kicking you out, Jake. I'm closing a chapter where I was only allowed to whisper while my name was on the spine. He stammered. It's not like we didn't want you. She interrupted, calm. You changed the locks, rewrote the equity, and told people I was losing my mind. Don't say want. Say what you did. Olivia chimed in carefully. We were trying to protect you. You seemed detached. Ruth's gaze didn't waver. Detached from a house I fund, a trust I own, or a dinner table I wasn't invited to until court papers made me a problem? Flashback. 8 years earlier, Jake sobbed in a hospital chair, clutching Ruth's hand after bad news. I can't lose you, Mom. You're the only thing that's always made sense. That boy had meant it. But the man sitting across from her now said nothing. Back in the dining room, Jake's voice cracked. I just want to stop fighting. Ruth placed her fork down. Then stop confusing guilt with grief. This house is a legacy, not a leash. The candles were burning low now. The playlist had looped. Dessert hadn't been served, but no one was hungry anymore. Ruth stood and placed her napkin beside her plate. Thank you for the roast. I suggest you speak to your new landlord about lease terms before the new month begins. Jake didn't follow her with his eyes. Olivia did. As Ruth reached the front door, Olivia tossed her napkin onto the table like a gauntlet. You'll regret making this public, Ruth. People love a scandal more than a sob story. Ruth paused at the threshold. Then you better make it a good one. She walked out without looking back because the next chapter didn't need an audience. It needed her name in bold on the header. They tried to erase me. I owned the watermark on the paper. It wasn't the usual legalese. This document had a heartbeat. Ruth sat in the corner of her attorney's office, her reading glasses slipping low on her nose as she scanned the last few lines of the trust. Maggie Tarlow sat quietly across from her, not interrupting, not translating, just waiting. Because some revelations didn't need to be narrated. The air in the room felt different than it had at the start. Charged, sacred. Maggie finally spoke, her voice measured. He filed it 14 years ago. You both signed. But I doubt either of you realized the structure he chose was a life estate trust. Ruth looked up. Explain it to me. Slowly. Maggie leaned forward and tapped the second paragraph of the trust. This language gives you full legal control of the property for as long as you live. No one, not Jake, not Olivia, not even a buyer, can remove or override your residency. They can't refinance you out. They can't sell your interest. The only way to dissolve it is if you sign. Ruth's eyes stayed fixed on the page. The print was small, but the truth was loud. So even if the court approves the partition, Maggie finished, your unit is untouchable. It's ironclad and enforceable. Silence filled the space, full and warm. Ruth didn't speak for a long moment. Then she said softly, he protected me from beyond the grave, and I almost let them take it anyway. She remembered the way her husband used to speak about paperwork, not like it was red tape, but like it was armor. Don't treat a signature like a formality, he'd once told her over late-night tea. It's your name stamped on the future. Make sure you like what it builds. At the time, she thought he was being dramatic. Now she realized he wasn't preparing for his death. He was preparing for her survival. Later that afternoon, Ruth returned home. She walked through her back unit in silence, every floorboard creak echoing like a small victory. She paused near the storage chest beneath her window seat. Inside, among yellowing letters and a folded American flag, was a bundle of old photographs. She didn't open it, not this time. She had already found what mattered. She made one phone call that evening, just one. Not to Jake, not to Olivia. To the buyers, a young couple who had expressed interest through her agent. No kids yet, respectful, quiet. The line rang once, then twice. Hi, this is Ruth Carter, she said. I'm ready to move forward with the listing, with one condition. Of course, the woman said. Go ahead. Ruth stared out her kitchen window into the small yard that separated her from the main house. We'll list everything, every inch of the property except the back unit. A pause. I retain occupancy for life. That space stays mine. Is that legally protected? Ruth smiled. More than they ever imagined. She hung up, walked to her desk, and opened a blank document. At the top, she typed, Revised Sale Agreement, Partial Property Transfer. Then beneath that, Retained Back Unit Residence, Carter Life Estate, Irrevocable. She hit save, then leaned back in her chair and whispered to herself, They tried to erase me, but I owned the watermark on the paper. Outside, wind rustled the rosemary bush her husband planted. Ruth picked up the phone again. This time, she dialed her lawyer. Maggie, let's prep the listing paperwork and make sure the buyers understand this house has a soul that's staying. They said I wouldn't go through with it. I sold the house, just not the part they were living in. The doorbell rang just after noon, the kind of precise timing that felt practiced. Ruth opened it calmly, the afternoon sun streaking across her front steps. The woman standing there wore pressed slacks, a sharp blazer, and the steady smile of someone who had read every footnote before making an offer. She held out a clipboard. Miss Carter, I'm Claire Mott, the buyer. I just wanted to introduce myself before escrow closes. I'll be assuming the front house and garage per the partial sale agreement. And I understand you'll remain in the rear unit? Permanent occupancy? Ruth returned the handshake. Correct. Life estate, I stay. Everything else yours. Claire smiled, businesslike but respectful. I admire what you did with the trust. You don't see that kind of foresight much these days. Ruth stepped aside and motioned toward the side path that led to the backyard. The ones who underestimate old paper are usually the first to drown in it. 3 hours later, a courier knocked on the front door. Jake answered, hair disheveled, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and confusion. The envelope was heavy legal paper. He opened it on the kitchen counter. Olivia stood beside him, arms crossed. Her lips moved first. What is this? Jake scanned the document, his eyes moving too fast to process it all. Notification of partial ownership sale. Main property transfer, effective immediately. Buyer, Claire Mott. Remaining life estate, Ruth Carter. Retained rights, back unit. She sold it, Jake whispered. She actually sold it. Not all of it, just this part. He dropped the papers. They fluttered onto the tile floor like a white flag. An hour later, Ruth rang the doorbell herself, not out of pettiness, just protocol. Jake opened the door, his face pale with realization. Olivia stayed seated at the dining table, silent. Ruth stepped forward just enough to let her voice carry. You have 2 options, Jake. You can coordinate with the new owner or leave on your own terms. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Ruth didn't wait for a reply. If she chooses eviction, it'll be swift, clean, legal. But I thought I'd give you one last chance to walk instead of being pushed. Jake nodded slightly, a wounded gesture, unsure of whether to blame himself or everyone else. Olivia didn't look up. Ruth returned to her unit and made tea. The sound of boiling water filled her small kitchen like a metronome ticking towards something final. Through her side window, she saw them on the front porch. Jake seated on the edge of the step, Olivia standing beside a suitcase, arms wrapped tight around herself. There was no yelling, no pleading, just a stillness that looked like grief in costume. Ruth watched the way Jake stared at the house, his childhood home, his launch pad, his entitlement. She could almost hear the echoes of his younger self laughing in the hallway, playing with action figures in the den, the boy who once said, "Don't ever move, Mom. This is the only place that feels like us." That boy was gone, and the man he became had mistaken kindness for surrender. The next morning, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Claire stepped out, clipboard in hand. She wore sunglasses, neutral lipstick, and the steady posture of someone used to difficult conversations. Jake and Olivia stood by the garage, already mid-pack. Tension crackled in the air, but no one spoke. Claire approached with professional calm. "Hi, I'll need access starting next week. Walkthroughs, inspections, tenant review. We can do this 2 ways, cordial or court-scheduled." She didn't wait for an answer. "Let me know by Friday." She handed Jake a printed schedule and walked off without looking back. Jake folded the paper in half. Olivia didn't even reach for it. Inside, Ruth sipped her tea slowly as Claire disappeared around the side of the house. She whispered to herself, more fact than feeling, "They said I wouldn't go through with it. Now they're packing their dreams into cardboard." He didn't apologize, but he handed me the key, and that was enough. The hose hissed as water cascaded over the rosemary, the soil darkening beneath Ruth's careful hands. She moved slowly along the garden bed, sleeves rolled to her elbows, the morning sun warming the back of her neck. Her teacup sat cooling on the brick ledge nearby. She didn't see Jake step out, but she felt him, the shift in air, the sound of his sneakers scraping softly against gravel. She didn't turn around, she just kept watering. He cleared his throat once, quietly, like he didn't want to break whatever thread of silence still connected them. Ruth reached for the next planter. Jake's shadow paused a few feet away, then moved closer. Finally, her hand stopped mid-motion when she sensed something extend toward her. She turned. He was holding something small, familiar, shiny with wear, a single silver key. No words, just his hand, open, still. Her gaze flicked from the key to his face. He didn't look angry or even remorseful, just tired, worn down in a way that felt honest. Ruth dried her hand on her gardening apron and reached out. She took the key gently, cradling it between her fingers like it might disintegrate. She gave the faintest nod, and Jake gave the faintest one back, then turned and walked inside. Flashback, age 12. Jake running down the hallway with his new middle school schedule flapping in one hand, the other holding out his very first locker key. "Here," he'd said, panting, grinning. "I trust you with everything, Mom, just in case I forget it." She'd laughed, slipped it on her own keychain, and ruffled his hair. "Then I'll keep it safe." Now, decades later, that memory felt like it belonged to another lifetime, another version of him, another version of her. Ruth placed the returned house key on the stone edge beside her tea and resumed watering the mint leaves, but her chest felt lighter, not healed, not vindicated, just less burdened by the weight of an apology that would never come. Olivia was gone by sundown. Ruth watched from her back window as she stuffed the last of her luggage into the back of a silver sedan. Someone else was driving. She didn't slam the door, didn't shout, just tossed one final glance toward the house like she was checking to see if it missed her already. It didn't. The sedan rolled away. No goodbye, no damage, just gone. Jake left 2 days later. A duffel bag over his shoulder, a cardboard box tucked awkwardly under one arm. Ruth didn't see where he went, just heard the sound of a car trunk closing, the engine turning over, then fading into the distance like the last line of a story she didn't write but finally stopped reading. On the kitchen counter that night, her phone buzzed with a soft ding. New email. Subject: Final partition completion and title confirmation. Ruth tapped it open. "Dear Miss Carter, we're pleased to confirm the full legal partition of the Carter property is now complete. Title has been officially split, and your retained life estate rights to the rear unit have been recorded and protected under California law. No further consent is required for the occupancy of your designated space. Congratulations." There was a PDF attached, with her name stamped in bold 4 times. She didn't print it. She didn't forward it. She just whispered to herself, "Mine. And not because they left, because I stayed." Ruth poured the last of her tea, placed the key in her drawer beside the trust papers, and closed it with care. Because legacies didn't need speeches, they needed witnesses. He wanted my name off everything. I left it on something bigger than the deed. The ink dried slowly as Ruth signed, "Carter Family Trust Addendum 13, Legacy Clause." Her granddaughter's full name sat beneath it, etched in careful ink. The notary glanced up. "You're sure you want to structure it this way?" "Yes," Ruth replied. "It's not a gift, it's a seed. She'll have to water it herself." He nodded, stamped the final page, and paused at the door. "Most people just leave money or property," Ruth smiled. "Most people leave problems. I'm leaving a mirror." The next morning, she laid the documents out on her old dining table. Title confirmation, life estate clause, and the new clause. Inheritance of the back unit to her granddaughter. Transfer only after Ruth's death and either a college degree or 18 months of full-time work. No early access, no legal shortcuts. The house would never again pass to someone who hadn't earned it. Ruth folded the document carefully and placed it inside a fireproof envelope, then slid it into a lockbox beneath her bed. The same one that had once held the original deed, now reborn as something far more sacred. Alongside it, she tucked a letter. The letter. "Dear Grace, by the time you read this, I hope you're taller than me and stronger than the world ever allowed me to be. This house was once meant to be a home for your father, but he forgot that homes aren't built with walls. They're built with memory, with intention, with respect. I couldn't save him from forgetting, but I hope you remember. You get this house when you've built something of your own first, not as a reward, but as a mirror. If it reflects who you are, then you're ready to walk through the door. Until then, know that someone signed her name on your future, and this time, no one gets to erase it. Love, Grandma Ruth." Ruth sealed the letter with a small wax stamp, an acorn, the same symbol her husband had used on their first business card. He used to say, "Acorns look small, but they rewrite the skyline." She placed the envelope in the box and wrote in thick black marker on the lid, "Do not open until you own your first key." Not a metaphor, not a riddle, a milestone. Later that afternoon, she walked through the garden, brushing her hand along the rosemary bush, the mint leaves, the tomatoes growing stubborn and sweet. She passed the empty swing where Jake used to sit barefoot, dangling his legs while she read the paper. There was no ache this time, just clarity. She wasn't haunted by what had been lost. She was grounded by what remained. Back inside, she made tea, black, strong, unsweetened. She sat at her desk, pulled out a new folder, and labeled it, "For Grace, Legal and Personal." As she filed it away, the late sun spilled across the floor in slanted gold. And for the first time in years, Ruth allowed herself to think in decades again, not in days. She hadn't won a war, she'd rewritten the map. That night, as she closed her drawer, Ruth whispered to the quiet, "He wanted my name off everything. I left it somewhere he can't touch, the future." They emptied the house, but peace filled every room they left behind. The silence was thick, but it wasn't hollow. Ruth sat cross-legged on her window seat, sipping tea from the same cracked porcelain cup she'd nearly thrown out twice. Outside, birds argued in the hedges, wind teased the chimes she'd rehung on the porch, and sunlight bathed the wooden floor in ribbons of honey gold. For the first time in years, there were no footsteps overhead, no passive-aggressive cupboard slams, no closed-door conversations muttered through drywall. Just jazz drifting low from her speaker and a sense of enoughness that soaked through her bones. The mail arrived at 10:22 a.m., as it always did. Inside the envelope marked deposit statement, Ruth unfolded her first passive income confirmation. Rent from the front unit, now occupied by a quiet couple with one cat, no drama, and an absurd respect for recycling schedules. She read the statement twice, not to count, but to appreciate. "Not a paycheck," she murmured. "A payback." Her husband's voice echoed faintly in her memory. "Let your investments talk louder than your explanations." She folded the slip, placed it neatly in a drawer beside her trust papers, and returned to the garden. The rosemary had nearly overtaken the corner bed, vibrant, sprawling, unapologetic. Ruth knelt beside it and dug gently with her gloved hands, making space for a fresh transplant. She pressed a new root down, hands in soil, breath calm. "Rosemary for remembering," she whispered, a phrase her husband had murmured so many times it became a charm. "Don't ever forget what you gave them." And she wouldn't. Not the house, not the trust, not the forgiveness she had offered without applause. She stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, then looked back toward the quiet windows of the front house. No curtains shifting, no voices raised, just stillness. Inside her unit, books were stacked neatly again. Shelves once buried behind boxes were now arranged by color and sentiment, her favorite biographies beside her husband's first edition novels. The jazz record sleeves she never had space to display now framed the walls like artwork. The space no longer apologized for its age, it celebrated it. And so did she. Later that evening, her email chimed. She almost ignored it. Subject line, referral, mentorship inquiry, WLA Network. Curious, she clicked. "Dear Miss Carter, your name was recently mentioned to us through the buyer of your front property, Claire Mott. She spoke highly of your estate clarity and preparedness. Our nonprofit, Women's Legal Aid Network, WLA Network, offers free legal navigation to single mothers and elder women transitioning out of unsafe co-ownership. Would you be open to mentoring 2 of our current clients on basic estate planning? Quietly, of course, we can adapt to your schedule. Warmly, Jinda, Program Director, WLA Network." Ruth sat back. She hadn't expected this. She wasn't looking for a new chapter, but maybe it had found her anyway. She looked around at the soft lamplight, the open book on her table, the calm purring of the house that had once been filled with friction and now only spoke in gentle sighs. Ruth didn't reply yet. She just leaned back in her chair and whispered into the stillness, "Maybe this house isn't done giving." She reached for her calendar, flipped to the next month, and circled 3 quiet afternoons. Just in case she said yes. He told the world I was just the co-signer, but everything they stood in was printed under my name. The folding chairs weren't fancy, the coffee was lukewarm. But the women who sat around the table, eyes alert, pens ready, listened like their lives depended on what came next. Because for some of them, it did. Ruth stood at the front of the community library's small meeting room, a modest stack of cream-colored folders in her arms. Her blazer was simple, her voice steady, her hands unshaking. "I'm not a lawyer," she said, "but I've been through enough to tell you exactly where to look before you co-sign anything." A murmur of soft laughter filled the room. One of the women in her late 40s nodded with a crooked smile. Another, barely 30, with a toddler asleep in the stroller beside her, looked like she was hearing her own story rewritten. On the whiteboard behind Ruth were 5 bullet points in careful black marker. Name order matters trust. Emotion, equity, ownership, never co-sign without paper control. Life estate, learn it, use it, protect yourself. She spoke without drama, without vengeance, just facts, delivered by a woman who had earned her scars. My husband used to say, "Don't give away a signature you wouldn't carve into stone." She paused, then added, "I carved mine in granite, and I made sure the deed was written on it." She handed out the folders, each labeled in gold ink. "Co-sign with caution, a toolkit for financial self-defense." Inside was a checklist, a copy of a sample trust, notes on power of attorney clauses, and a single page with Ruth's handwriting scanned and printed. At the top, "Before you protect someone else's future, protect the part of yourself they might forget to carry with them." The workshop ended with quiet handshakes. One of the widows lingered behind. "I didn't know I could say no to my son. He made it sound like I'd be abandoning him." Ruth placed a hand gently on the woman's arm. "You're not abandoning anyone. You're just refusing to bury yourself under their dreams." She watched the woman leave with her folder hugged to her chest like armor. By the time Ruth walked home, the afternoon light had melted into soft lavender. She removed her shoes at the edge of her back patio and stepped barefoot onto the cool stone tiles of her garden. The rosemary bush swayed beside the pergola, fuller than ever. She poured herself a glass of iced tea and lowered into the worn wicker chair beneath the wooden beams. A breeze slipped through the yard, catching the edges of the wind chimes and sending a single yellow leaf spinning through the air like a final signature across an invisible page. She closed her eyes, listening not for silence, but for what had taken its place. No footsteps, no slammed drawers, just the house, breathing beside her, still, whole. Her final voiceover-style monologue. "They told the world I was just the co-signer, but I was the down payment, the roof, the foundation, and the interest paid on every mistake. Sometimes signing your name means opening a door. Sometimes it means closing one. Either way, I write mine in ink." She stood, returned inside, and placed the extra folders from the workshop in a drawer labeled Legacy. One of them would go to Grace one day. The rest, well, some stories were meant to be passed like heirlooms, quietly, deliberately. She turned out the lights, walked to the back wall, and reached for the final frame waiting to be hung. A photograph. Jake, age 5, standing on the porch in a red jacket, his hand tucked inside hers. The house behind them looked bigger then, but Ruth now knew it had always been small until she stood her full height inside it. She pressed a nail into the wall and hung it. Straight, firm, final. They wanted my signature. I gave them a legacy on my letterhead.